figs. I work here as a volunteer preparing dinosaur bones down in my little enclosure downstairs.
Okay.
And I was asked to introduce our speaker, Natalia Byokova, who's here all the way from Russia.
Okay.
And she has studied geology and stratigraphy and paleontology at Novosibirsk State University in Russia, as well as geobiology at Virginia Tech, where she received her PhD in 2017. And currently she's on the faculty at University of Missouri Columbia, correct?
Postdoctoral scholar.
Oh, you're a doctoral scholar?
No, postdoctoral.
Postdoctoral,
Yeah.
okay, she's doing her postdoc.
Yeah, all
That's
the
not on here.
yeah, all the terminology.
They didn't put any of that on here, so I didn't know.
It's
I
okay.
thought you were faculty.
Yeah, it's okay.
Anyway, her research interests span a wide range of geobiological problems, focusing mostly on the pre-Cambrian history of the Earth. This is the earliest period of the Earth's history, from 542 million back to 4.5 billion. So mainly she's interested in organism-environment interactions and how they shaped our planet through time, and that's the subject of tonight's talk.
Thank you so much.
Without further ado,
Thank you so much for introduction, and thank you so much for being here on Wednesday night. And just a little remark, I'm so sorry. But it seems like I always have that problem because, like I know we in Saint Genevieve, I probably pronounce it wrong, I know. But for some reason, Americans pronounce the Russian last names always incorrectly. I do not know why. Like it's always like you put the syllable on the last part of the last name, but it's usually on the first. So Byokova, not Byokova. I'm so sorry.
oh,
Would you say that again?
Byokova. So it's not Byokova, it's Byokova. And it's same for all the athletes. Like all the athletes, they pronounce differently, not the way you used to it. And we had lunch at work, and we were trying to figure out, like, is that person? And Jim Shift Power, my boss was like, no. I was like, it's that name. He was like, no. And then another person pronounced it wrong. I was like, yeah, that one. I was like, that's exactly the name I was talking about. So like, I know that it's happening all the time, but yeah, we usually pronounce it differently.
Boo-boo.
Yes, exactly. So today, I know that here you have like dinosaurs, and it's probably the biggest, centerpiece of the museum, and probably people come here for dinosaurs. But I'm going to almost, like I have one slide with dinosaurs in it, but that's about it. I want to talk to you today about what life did to our planet and why, in that sense, our planet is really unique, at least for the solar system, at least what we know for now. And usually when we do any research in geology, there are almost always two competing theories of explanation. And one is always includes any physical processes. Like, dinosaurs were killed by asteroid, right? The Permian-Triassic mass extinction, the biggest one, when like 80 to 90% of all animals died because of the Siberian traps. Thank you, Siberia, which were erupting for a long time, right? So we all, like most of the time, we have explanation which includes something or like, solar insolation change or chemistry change or any physical environment, basically. And very often, if we talk to paleontologists or geobiologists, they very often will say, like, yeah, that was happening, but also on top of that, something was happening with life. And we actually very often cannot part apart what was the reason for the event. Is it biology was driving all of those physical changes? Or it was actually physical changes which drove the changes in biology? And today I will be mostly talking about the biological part of the processes. So here what usually we know as, of course I cannot do that, we know as Cambrian explosion, which happened around like 520, 530 million years ago, when accidentally in the paleontological record we start to see everything. So before that we haven't seen anything, and then boom, everything. And it's really like dramatic change if you see it in the outcrop. It's like you cannot find anything, and then like, you know, trilobites like jumping on you, basically. It's very amazing. And but that was pretty late. It's like 540, right? 530 million years ago. But we know that that the solar system, the estimates, like today's estimates, around 5.6 billion years old. And if we're talking about the Earth itself, it's it will be also about 4.6, but it's like 4.56, whatever. So they were pretty close in terms of timing. But like the Cambrian explosion happened only like 500 million years ago. So like for the most part of the Earth history, something was happening there, right? And we don't really talk about it that often because everybody excited about dinosaurs. I mean, they cool, I do agree. And so if we're talking about Earth, like what was happening on the Earth, so since it's formed around 4.6, we have
I know the artist.
Yes. So the late heavy bombardment was happening somewhere between 4.1 to 3.8 billion years ago. And for a long time, we assumed that during that time, there is no way we would have anything on the Earth because the environment just wasn't really, you know, nice. When something keeps falling on you and there is like molten lava everywhere, it's not nice. Like we used to something like, you know, more convenient environment for life. Yeah, and so. Basically, what we know about the oldest evidence of life, which we have, it's 3.77, so it's around 3.8, so around the time when the bombardment stopped. And how do we know it? We basically, so all of this is microscopic, as you can see, so it's really tiny, but we basically found those hematite filaments, and hematite is the iron oxide basically, and so we found it and we analyzed the chemistry and the morphology, and the only way you can make it, it's only with life. So that's why we think that it's the oldest fossils which we found on Earth. And it makes sense, it's right after the heavy bombardment stopped, so it's kind of got a little bit quieter, and you know, maybe we can start life there. Although like we already have filaments, right? So like we don't have just cells or just spheres, we already have filaments of stuff, which is interesting, like at the very beginning. But as with everything what is probably older than Cambrian really, with everything there are always a lot of debate. But this like most of the community kind of accepted. And that was true till last month. Because just last month, I think it's even a little bit less, I think it was like 12th of July when the paper came out. So, I mean, in reality it's more like thought experiments. So the group of my colleagues from Bristol and some other institutions in UK, they decided to say, okay, we know that like the first life should be microbial, right? But like how, like what we can say about like how, like when it was supposed to start. So they did some thought experiment with some of the microbes, known one, which we assumed they were there at that time. And based on some molecular clock data, like I'm not going into details of that, about that, but based on the molecular data and molecular clock data, it seems that the first, like the last universal common ancestor, so like the first thing which appeared ever in terms of biology, according to that, and they run it multiple times, so it's not like, just once, supposed to appear at 4.2, which is even before like heavy bombardment, right? Because heavy bombardment was from 4.1 to 3.8. And so that's actually raised a lot of questions. And it didn't raise questions only now, but in general, even at 3.7, when we start to see the first organisms, like as I said, we already have filaments. So we how fast it was supposed to be happening, and then the true organism appeared only like at 500 millions. So like why evolution was so slow before that, or how did we got those organisms like that complex in a way from the beginning? And so with that, we go into some space adventure, and you probably have heard about the habitable zone. And pretty much that's like what we're looking for, like when we look for life in the different planets and the different systems, we basically trying to calculate if they are in the habitable zone. So basically, do they have enough insulation, the temperature, the composition, and all of that could be calculated. And so the habitable zone, if we're talking about the solar system, is actually moves, like it's not stable. And it's not stable because the insolation of sun changes. And so if we look at like 1 billion years ago, for example, it seems that the habitable zone was supposed to include Mars. And if we look now, we know that like it kind of doesn't really, like we don't really see, anything big walking on the surface of the Mars, at least. And if we move forward, the habitable zone will move from the Earth. And because it just will not be enough insulation to sustain the life. And with that, basically raised the question of like life on Earth, because it was in the habitable zone for quite a long time, and it was probably before the Earth was in habitable zone. And based on the information we know today, yes, we are pretty far away from each other, right? Like you cannot just casually go to Mars, but there are plenty of meteorites from Mars who reach the Earth by itself, like, nobody like throwing them to us. So there are some meteorites which come to Earth, and to add on it, some microbes, they actually can survive to be in space. So it's actually not that such a crazy idea to think that we all, in a way, Martians, because by the time we get the first fossils, they're already complex. And life, like evolution, it does take time. And we actually have done a lot to try to prove, or disprove, get any information on what's happening on Earth or on Mars, or what was happening. And so it was a lot of good and not as good attempts to try to see what's happening on Mars. And we still do, and hopefully we will get samples back. We have, everybody excited. When a couple of months ago, I saw that NASA posted the advertisement for people to work on the samples we are going to come from Mars. It's already, we didn't got samples yet. But they're already looking for people, which is great. But what is interesting so we have the question, and everybody's so we don't know if there is life on Mars or if there is no life on Mars. I mean, by now it is. We brought it with our first missions, when we didn't care about what's sterilization of it. But what is interesting, and not as many people talk about it, that during the Vikings missions, Dr. Gilbert Levin, he was one of the people, of the scientists who were advised people to, deal with the scientific part of it. And he proposed a really interesting idea of how to test if there is life on Mars or not. Because at that time, we didn't thought about bringing anything back. But because it was like 1970s, but working with the different questions on Earth, he realized that if we put any nutrient, so any food, to the media which has life, any microbe life, and if we mark it with radioactive nuclei, life, when it's eaten, it will, produce gases which will have those radioactive nuclei in them. And that's what they did. That's what both Vikings actually did. And in both cases, I think they reproduced it like 3 or 4 times. Every single time they got a spike in the gas. And they try to see, if there are some chemical explanations, because obviously, every time it's okay, we found it. It's no, but what if it's not? Because it's it's on Mars. And so pretty much back almost 50 years ago, the experiment showed that there is life on Mars, but we're still searching for life on Mars. And as a geologist, I'm the most excited one about sea actual rocks, obviously. But there is at least some life on Mars, and most probably that's what came to us and gave the beginning to our life. And that's the work which was done later already with the Curiosity. And they also found some organic components in there, meaning that it should be at least some organic matter there. It may be not alive anymore, but there is organic matter on Mars. But what about Earth? So I was talking about 3.7, so it's the very first one, and we kind of do believe that it's fossil, but there are a lot of questions. But now we will talk about Australia, where kind of more people agree to that, and it's 3.5 billion years. So by that time it's okay, at 3.5 everybody kind of happy that life probably was there. And this is Western Australia. Yeah, sometimes it's very green. You would not think about it because it's desert, but sometimes it's very green. And this is one of my colleagues, Bill Shop, from UCLA. He's father of the oldest fossils found, and this is the apex chord, and this is the original publication of which he did, where he showed again those tubular filament looking structures. They again pretty small, those are micrometers, and he showed that it was some life, some microbes were living, probably bacteria, but there are some questions. And that happened some time ago. It was, what is that? It was 1993, so 30 years ago. And you would think it's okay, he showed, everything's good, right? But since then, every once in a while, we keep having those publications from the same place. And the red ones, those ones which is nah, not fossils. The green ones was no, they are fossils. They are real deal. And those ones, I believe those two, they from, well, that's 2016, that one from, this one. These two, they from 2023, so from the last year. So even though, again, it was shown 30 years ago, but still for 30 years, people keep studying the same specimens, trying to see if they really are truly fossils, because I was okay, there is organic matter, but what if it's not original organic matter? What if it just came there after, the weird processes happening there? But that's the oldest one, which kind of accepted. Another evidence, pretty much from the same period of time, also from Australia. Australia hosts a lot of old stuff, a lot of old fossils, and the oldest zircon grain, 4.6, is also from Australia. So Australia is really good for old stuff. And so here we have environment which is not like you would not think about as for life to be found, but what they analyzed some quartz or silica inside of those, like in between the pillow basalts, which were supposed to be erupting under the water, and they looked closely and they found fluid inclusions, so some air trapped inside of the rock when it was forming. And what is interesting about bubbles, they tiny, again, those like 50 microns, and they like, you barely can see them. Those fluid inclusions, they have organic matter in them. Like there is no way, you can reintroduce the organic matter inside of the fluid inclusions, which are already inside of the rock, which is like 3.5 almost billion years old. So that's another evidence of some life truly existing on the Earth during that time. And then, like most of the time, we were talking about bacteria, and we were talking about that because, for the most part, again, it was just a recent discovery, really, 1977. I mean, I haven't been born by that time, but it's still, for science, it's really recent, when we found basically a new domain in life, and those are archaea. So before that, we had just bacteria, eukaryotes, and we kind of divided them in a different way. And only in 1977, the new domain, which is huge, basically like part of it, like it's 1/3 of all life which we have, and there are a lot of archaea, but we knew nothing about them for the most time. And so as soon as we found them here, of course, we started to look for them in the back. And what is interesting about archaea, because when we think about evolution and how all of that started, what is interesting about archaea, that one of the ideas of how eukaryotes actually become, a thing here, and we are with you eukaryotes. We do have nuclei inside of our cells. So the modern theory on that basically archaea cell, and archaea cell is much bigger than bacteria one. So basically it's a symbiosis. So archaea cell at some point basically ingested bacterial cell, and bacteria, it didn't die. Instead, it became different parts inside of the cell. And when it happened, we basically, from prokaryotic cells, which do not have any organelles inside, we become eukaryotic cells when we have the different differentiations inside. And obviously, when we look about life and what was happening on the Earth, we're always curious when that happened. Because eukaryotes would be, we are eukaryotes, right? All the animals are, most of the animals are they have eukaryotic cells. So we're always curious, when that happened, because to know the events. And for that, we're also looking on what was happening further. So this is what is known as banded iron formations. Beef, and as you can see here, we have those wonderful lines, darker and lighter in color. The darker ones, the red ones, they are mostly iron in a different mineralogies, and the lighter ones, most of the time, some kind of silica. And this is there are a lot of papers written about the formation of beef. We still don't know exactly how it happens, but based on the fact that all iron which we mine comes from banded iron formations, there is no way you can make that much iron just chemically precipitating it from the water. You need some catalyzer, you need to catalyze in that process. And one of the major ideas of what was happening, that all of that was happening with the help of microbes. There are different versions of how exactly that was happening, but basically to make all of that, and when you find them, usually they're pretty thick. It's not just a couple of layers down there. They're pretty thick, and all of that was possible only with help of a lot of microbes, like a lot, to facilitate the process. And that did change the look of the Earth. And when we look at the other things, so we do have a lot of banded iron formations, but to the certain time, like today, they do not form. And you know why? Because iron, like we cannot have iron in today's atmosphere, like it doesn't precipitate, it's oxidized immediately, right? Like if you leave any metal, like iron instrument outside in the rain for winter, the next time you look at it, it probably will be rusty, right? Because like iron does not like oxygen in that sense. And so we do have them a lot, but like to the certain point, and at some point they just disappear. Like, you know, like they've never been there. And then at some point we start to see paleosoils. And of course we haven't had true plants by then, because it's like, again, 2.5. We haven't had soil, we haven't had true plants there. But in order to break down, yeah, you can do it physically, but it also, like, it's happening much faster when you facilitate it with life. And then we have, for example, this evidence of different kind of detrital grains. In this case, it's pyrite and siderite. Again, in today's atmosphere, you cannot have it because they oxidize. Siderite oxidized, and siderite is the carbonate, iron carbonate. Pyrite oxidized. If we talk about, and that's from Australia. If we talk about, for example, South Africa, they have pyrite and uraninite, which again, they do not form in the oxidized conditions, but back in 2.5 billion years ago, they were just fine. Like, you know, river were carrying pyrite grains, and it was okay. It was not oxidizing. It was not turning water into a bad liquid. And then something happens, and we start to see rat beds, which has hematite around that black kind of outline of the grains. It's hematite. And hematite is, as I mentioned before, is the iron oxide. So in order to make it, you need to have oxygen, and we haven't really had any before. And if we look at the different chemicals and isotopes of chemicals, you know, you see, like in this case it's sulfur, and this is from 4 billion years ago, and you go like there is, you know, some differences, and then in 2.5 something happens, and you start to have that like really big fractionation difference in the isotopes. And at this time, we also started to see a lot of those filaments around. So what happened, like why, like, you know, before 4.5, we have all of this like evidence of no oxygen, and then something happened. What happened is probably because of all of those cyanobacteria which we find, and we find them a lot around this time. They don't do it on purpose, but as a byproduct of their life, they produce oxygen. It's not like, you know, it's the goal of their life. No, it just happened that when they eat, they basically poop out oxygen. It just like, they're nice organisms. And so they were doing it, but it was like a lot of them. And so what happened, they changed our planet forever, because what known as great oxygenation event, which happened around 2.5 billion years ago, since then our planet never looked the same, because as soon as you introduce oxygen, you know, different processes start to happening. And actually one of the biggest questions in terms of evolution of life is the oxygen availability. Because for us, for example, for true animals to live or to survive, we need a certain amount of oxygen. We don't need a lot. Like if we have too much, it will probably kill us, because, you know, oxygen like burns tissues. So like breathing 100% oxygen is not a good idea. Don't do that for a long time. But in that case, we had a little bit of oxygen. It wasn't as today. It was much smaller, like percent, like 1% of today's amount, and today's like 21%. But it was enough to sparkle other life to come and start to evolve on the Earth. And that's around time, so it's 2.4, and around 1.7, 1.6, we start to see those really interesting microfossils. They're still micro, they're bigger than previous ones, but we start to see those really weird bigger cells, and not only bigger, it's not just spheres or just filaments. We start to have all those, like, kind of hairs on them, and prokaryotes do not do that. Like, they just don't. There is no need for that. So as soon as we start to see that, and like as you can see, these ones they're pretty old. They 1.7, 1.6, and these ones around 700, like 800 million years. We start to see those really bigger and more complex microorganisms, and that's the time when we think that true eukaryotes started to be present on our planet. So it's pretty much our grand relatives. That's how life started, like the eukaryotic lineage, which we are part of. And so if we look at the timeline, so we talked about the oldest fossils, the first eukaryotic common ancestors, the earliest fossil evidence on land. I was talking about the paleosoils. And then we, around 2.5, we start oxygenic photosynthesis with all those cyanobacteria. The great oxidation event hit, and then it pretty much took us not a billion of years, but a long time. Like from here, from first oxygen to the first eukaryotic cell, it was almost a billion of years. And it's like, from cell, like from a cell to just more complex cell. So it takes a lot of time. So when we think that's like, here we got like filaments right away, it's like, it's really interesting and really hard to explain in that way. And obviously after that, pretty much it just all kind of diversification, all kind of complexity which was happening to the eukaryotes. And they were doing remarkable things. Of course, the first remarkable thing, it was the actual oxygen in the atmosphere. But we start to have, and it's like pretty old, like it's still 1 billion years ago, but we start to have different kind of algae, which we still have today. Like this one, for example, Bungiamorpha, which was published by our colleagues from UK. Like we have the modern red algae, which looks exactly the same. Like, for billions of years, it looks exactly the same, which is fascinating. Protocladus, and why it's proto? Because there is modern cladus species in the green algae, which again looks exactly like this, but with the one difference that this one is 1 billion years old. But it's a remarkable similarity in between. And also we start to see pretty much at the same time, we start to see the first fungi in the paleontologic record. Of course, they don't look like, mushrooms you eat. They look quite different, but that's when they started. So they were here for quite a while by now. And so basically we have these guys by 1 billion, and then we have all the most of the algae, or Archaeoplastida, like the fancy name for the algae. And what was happening? So here, just some more. That's a little bit later. So 820. So we don't find it just like we find one fossil and we just assume that it was there. No, we do find them from time. Like I'm not just going through every single appearance of them, just because it would be too long. And also, who cares about the second appearance, right? We always look for the first one, for the biggest one, for the fastest one. Everything else is just kind of just there. That's why everybody excited about dinosaurs. They were the big ones. Not only these things, but we also have the different kind of algae, excavate algae. They like smaller, and they look exactly the same today as they looked 800 million years ago. This is 750 million years ago, and this is recent organism, and it looks exactly the same as everything else on this slide. And we think, or my colleagues think from California, that these are the first testate amebas. So they basically had the shell on them. So that would be the first shell organisms on the planet. When we think about shells, we usually think about, bivalves and like all that shells we find on the beach. So they were not that. They were much smaller, of course. But it's an interesting process which actually requires a lot of energy and certain genes to be on. Yes?
I was just wondering, would these be the forerunners to the first foraminifera?
They may be. They may be. And so, but this process requires a lot of things in terms of metabolism to actually make the shell. And so, again, we have the diversification here, and then we about to hit the snowball Earth. You may heard about that, right? That, for some period of time, it's a pretty long period of time, I should say, people think, scientists think, our colleagues think that the entire Earth was covered by ice. And of course, there are a lot of questions with that. It's like, okay, if for almost 100 millions of years, the Earth was just covered with ice, how life survived? Because we know life was before, we know life was after, what was happening? But it's always a question, why snowball happened? What you were supposed to do with Earth to drive it to be so cold, and especially because we do find the evidence for ice in the basically equatorial regions. So the answer to that, or possible answer to that, that's what we speculate about with some of my colleagues from University of Maryland, and I just went to the field work in Australia last summer, and we look at those fossils, which probably do not look like anything to you. Those horseshoe.
Be very careful to never touch the screen.
Okay.
It's a touch screen.
Okay. So
because I accidentally did that during my presentation.
Okay. So this horseshoe-looking thing, which probably you would never even look at it. But we think, and it was published actually before, but at that time, our colleagues from Princeton, they haven't had a lot of evidence. But now we think that they may be the first sponges. And if they were sponges at around 700 or 650, before the Ice Age, what they would do, what modern sponges do in the ocean? Do you know? What do they do to the water?
They filter it.
They filter water. And so if we would have sponges, and we found them pretty much at least in 3 continents around that time. If you get a lot of sponges in the water, which start to filter water, and it's getting clean, and basically it gets a lot of organic matter, so it stores all of that, you basically free oxygen. So it was some oxygen, but it was bonded to other things. So if they eat all of that and they store that organic matter, they free up oxygen, which otherwise would oxidize that organic matter. And you get a lot of oxygen and not as much CO2 or other gases in the atmosphere. And yes, we do care about CO2 and we try to lower it down. But actually, the low concentration of CO2, it means that we do not have the gases which actually protects us, right? Which actually hold all that warmth to the Earth. And what happens? The Ice Age. because basically we do not have anything to hold all of that heat. It comes down, but it's not like it got reflected and goes out back to the space. And so my colleagues and I, what we think that happened there, or why we actually got the snowball Earth, it's probably because of the emergence of the sponges. And again, like most of the time, you know, there are other explanations why that happened. But there is biological one too, which may like we never would be able to like divide it. But even during that time, so that was, I mean, recent, like 10 years ago, almost by now. And it's actually the only fossils, with the exception of microscopic fossils, that's the only macroscopic fossil which we find during that time in between the ice ages, you know, just a little bit amount of sedimentary rocks. And in those rocks, in this case in China, God preserved those macroalgae. And they look exactly the same like the ones we before or the ones after. So we know that life survived that. And again, we do think like there are those theories that like the whole Earth was just like, you know, snowball. But we actually don't know for sure. It was all covered or it was some regions which were not. Right? Yeah, exactly. And after that, as soon as the snowball melted down, we started to have these guys. And I love them dearly because I study them. But basically, it's the first time in the Earth history, it was relatively short-lived. I mean, for geologists, it's short-lived. I mean, millions of years, but it's short. We started to have macroscopic, we had some algae, but again, it was the same thing with dinosaurs, right? When you find dinosaur, nobody cares about what was with dinosaur there, right? We found dinosaur. The same thing with algae. If anything else is found, especially something with maybe animals, nobody cares about algae. Nobody even studies them or report them, which really hurt my heart because I love algae and I do study them. But basically, it was the first time when we started to have macroscopic organisms. For the most part, we have no idea what they were doing. Nowadays, if not all of them, but some of them, we think were animals. For example, Kimberella, for a long time, it was reconstructed as basically proto-mollusks because it does has the mantle like mollusks do. It has kind of that shell, even though it wasn't any hard material to it. So we do kind of have mollusks here. With these guys, it's hard, it's Charnian, it's hard, we don't know. Like some people think that it's they were animals, some people think that it may be weird algae, who knows. With these guys, which is Dickinsonia, it's an interesting story. My colleague, Ilya Bobrovsky, he found a very good preservation in White Sea, which had still organic matter on it. So they analyzed organic matter, which again, like 550 million years old. And based on the composition, they find the chemical composition, they think that it must be animal. But again, who knows? But they were really nice. They were composing those like really weird, like, you know, patterns. Very often they would be like fractal patterns of those kind of tubular looking things. So nothing like that exists today, just in case. So it was really weird time for the life on the Earth. But it's basically like, you know, like Michelin Man in a way. So it was like those really, or like, you know, mattress, which has all those like divisions inside of it. So that's how organisms were built. Again, we don't know what they were. For the most part, but they definitely were doing something to the environment, and they were living on the microbial mat. And during that time, around like by the end of Ediacaran, or close to the end of Ediacaran, we also start to see what looks like trace fossils. So it's basically the trace which like some kind of organism left out there. And you think like, why would we care, right? We have animals there. Why would we care about some traces? It turned out that in order to make trace like that, you need to be bilateralian. Like you cannot make trace like that if you do not have left and right side. Like it's impossible. So it means that like we don't have organism, we have no idea what they were, like no clue. But based on the trace they left, we know that by that time, bilaterians, which we are with you, we have left and right side, they were there. We just don't have evidence of that, like we don't have actual fossils. But the bilaterians were already there, wandering around. And those ones in Ediacaran, they still like, just a couple. In a couple of places we have those traces. They're usually pretty simple, nothing major. But there are a lot of microbial mats there. So we've reached like here, like the oldest metazoans and diversification of animals. And so what was going next? So in Ediacaran, when I was showing that picture of colorful picture, they were living on that green kind of slime surface. All that surface is microbial mat. So here you can see it's actually preserved microbial mat from the White Sea, really nicely preserved. So you actually can see the filaments of like cyanobacteria which form it. So it's basically like, when you walk around some petals which were there for a long time and it's a hot weather and it's evaporating and it was staying there like stagnant water and it started to like make all those bubbles and like green stuff like start to form there. They were that. But what was cool about it, they were covering like whole surface of the ocean floor, or at least most part of like shallow ocean. They were everywhere, and the Ediacarans were living on them. And that's basically the modern mat from the North Sea, and it looks exactly like the one from the White Sea. When we go to Cambrian, so when we pass that Cambrian, Precambrian boundary right before the Cambrian explosion with which we started at the beginning, we start to have crazy, and I'm meaning crazy, like they are big. So we in millimeter scale, like so those like at least like 10, 15 centimeters in diameter, which probably means nothing to you as much as inches means to me. But that's okay. And so in early Cambrian, we start to have that crazy bioturbation, so like basically all rocks are destroyed. They were looking for food. And what they were eating? Remember I just told you, all that was covered was microbial mat. And they were eating that mat and they destroyed it. And you would think like, okay, something, it's some green slime nobody cares about. What's a big deal? Well, turned out it was a really big deal for that time. And in scientific realm, it's usually referred as first agronomic revolution. And the reason for that, because back in Ediacaran, so like 560, 570, 555, 550, 540 many years ago, you had that really nice microbial mat on the top, which were covering the surface, meaning that it was sealing it. So basically, your sediment reacted as a closed system. Remember, like chemistry classes, there is closed system and there is an open system. So in Ediacaran, it was closed system. Nothing, like, it wasn't a lot of interchange between the sediment and the surface. But as soon as we start to have these guys who are like drilling inside and eating all of that, they made it an open system. And what did it do? First of all, it killed all the Ediacarans. Thank you very much. Second, it mixed up the top layer of the sediment. And when they were mixing up, when they were going down, because we already had some oxygen in water, right? So when they would go down, they would bring all that oxygen with them through all those holes which they were burrowing through the burrows. So basically, they changed all chemistry which was happening in the sediment. So like when we came to Cambrian, it was a completely different system. Like the ecosystem changed dramatically. Here it was really easy, microbes, big stuff, done. There is no anything, any predators, well, maybe some, not really big predators. The ecosystem was really easy, like two end members done. But as soon as we started to do that, as soon as the bilaterians appeared and they started to go down, we mix it up and we made it very, very diverse ecosystem. And what is good about it? If you think about it, if you have just two end members, if you kill in one, your ecosystem crashes because it cannot survive just on one end member. But when you have a really, really diverse community, even if you bump out one, you still have another 100. So yes, like we're really sorry, it's a bad day, something got out, but it still survives, like the whole ecosystem survives. So it's really good for the ecosystem to have all of that diversity. And so that's like after the agronomic revolution, that what happened, like, right? Everything appeared in one moment. So we for 4 billion years, we were like really, coming slowly, like that thing appeared and then that little thing appeared and we just were so happy and it changed a lot. And then in one moment, everything appeared, like everything what we know today. Of course, some of it died, but most of the animals we know today appeared back then. So it's around 530 million years ago. And so all those like different kind of arthropods, and like we do have the microfossils still, of course, and the sponges and a lot of things. Here we have all those like crown group of arthropods, so like basically trilobites, right? Or today all the insects, the arthropods, the creepy crawling stuff, which I don't like. But that's okay. I don't study it anyway. What is cool about it that a lot of them, a lot of them had, like we used to think that these guys, like Amalecaris, that it was the top predator, which was like, eating everybody, like hunting with all those claws in it. Well, Amalecaris itself maybe were doing it, but turned out that most of its relatives, they were not doing that. Turned out that all those claws, they have structures which look like balloons in whales today. So they most probably were filtrators. They were big and probably scary, but they were not hunting like, actively stuff. They were filtrating water. And again, what do you think happened? So we start to have in Cambrian a lot of stuff which start to filter water, right? Remember, we already talked about filtering water before, and filtering water before resulted in the snowball Earth. So it was like, okay, I don't know, was it good? So those balloons, the parts and the claws, which were most probably the filtrating apparatus. And beautiful reconstructions. There are so many reconstructions of the big stuff. And like, again, as soon as we go to the animals, everybody excited. Nobody excited about small stuff.
Those are the challenges.
And so like, basically, again, like they changed everything, like all the chemistry of the ocean, because they were filtering the water, so getting all of that organic matter from it. And then the big stuff basically were pooping, and all of that poop would go down, again storing all of that organic matter, and again freeing all of that oxygen out. And that was happening around like late Cambrian, beginning of our division. And you know what happened at the end of our division?
Ice Age.
Ice Age. Surprise, surprise. So it works pretty much in the same patterns, the same way it happened like 650 million years ago, the same happened in our division. And the next big step, it was going out, going on land. Because before that, all we were talking about was talking about sea, right? About the marine stuff. But later on, around our division time, we start to see the trackways but in the sediments which were definitely not marine. So these ones are aeolian, so it's like wind blowing stuff. So it's like in a desert kind of environment. There is no way it was under the water. But we do have trackways on that. So we do know that they were supposed to be out of the water, and like what they were doing there, like what they were doing outside of water, because like everything we know was in the water, right? And like some of them pretty big. So that's big. Like that's the width. Yeah, they beautiful, they big, and they were. Yeah,
My
Johansson.
thesis advisor.
Okay. Oh, I had no idea.
Ellis Johansson.
Yeah. Okay. And Fedonkin, the Russian guy, academician. And so basically, the only way they would, be outside of water where you have solid insulation, which you need to protect yourself, it's food. Like, it's always about food. Like, because we're always trying to preserve our energy. So the only way they would be going out, it's food. And basically during that time, we started to have the first kind of soil crust. They still, again, we don't have the true, plants back then, but we started to get in there. And that's probably why they were getting outside. And we have all of those land plants. They tiny, again, we're going back to micron scale, so like you would not be able to see them by the naked eye. But again, we start to have plants on the surface also around our division. And again, like they were doing, so we, in the marine environment, we're filtering all that water, and on the surface, we're getting plants, and like, what plants do, right? They also produce oxygen, right? They eat CO2 and they're getting out oxygen. So we came to that glaciation from both sides, from the earth, like from the land and from the sea. Basically, all of that played together to get our planet again to the ice age. And then if we going further to Devonian, we start to see those gigantic, those Prototaxites. They thought, like, we still thinking what it was. There are ideas that it probably was some kind of fungi, but they got really big, like really big. And that's some of the reconstructions of the Devonian land. So most of the plants were still around the water, and all of these, like a lot of animals would go out and eat all of that. And later on, we start to see all of that great diversity of different plants. They're still quite small for the most part, except of the ones which I showed, which is Devonian. This is Silurian. And another interesting thing happened during that time, because plants actually they do need roots to grow in, but like if you think that they directly get nutrients from the soil, it's not exactly that way. They actually cannot get it directly from soil. They need certain fungi inside of them, which actually eat food. They break it down, and there's like, here you go, eat it. It's tasty. And so during that time, we actually do have fossil evidence of that. So that symbiosis or colonization of those different kind of fungi inside of the plants, a different part of plants, actually allowed plants to grow bigger and diversify in the longer, because if you can grow roots bigger and it can get more food with help of those fungi, you actually can stay like further away from the water. You don't need water to be so close to you. And it's really helped the plants to get around. And as soon, of course, so there are like differences. So basically with the evolution of plants, we start to be developing the soil layer, first of all, because like all the roots, they're breaking down all of that. And also because of all of those organs, they also produce a lot of oxygen. So we keep bringing up the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, which again allows the bigger animals to be surviving because they need more oxygen to their metabolism. And here, the first evidence for rooting system, basically what was doing all of that, where we have fungi, is around 400 million years ago. So still pretty long time we're here. And roots doing a really cool thing, and like plants in general, they not only bring in oxygen, they don't help with soil, they also stabilizing it. Because if we're looking at the Ediacaran or very early rivers, they were what we called braided rivers. So they were just flowing on the surface, nothing was stopping them. I mean, some microbial mats maybe, but they were just the water was just flowing through. There is nothing what would stop it. So it wasn't rivers in the modern understanding of that. In order to have rivers like today, like if we look at Missouri, right, or Mississippi, the reason why it has the banks and it doesn't go further, it doesn't erode that, it's because we have all of that vegetation alongside, which actually stabilize the banks, and it doesn't allow the river to go further and erode all of it. I mean, it happens sometimes, but not as drastically. And so the more complex vegetation and more vegetation you have, you basically changing the look of the earth overall, because it does change. Even rivers flow differently from before. And another really cool adaptation with the roots, it's stomata. So basically stomata, those openings which we have on the surface of leaves, which allows leaf to lose or preserve water inside. And again, when you have stomata, and you can regulate it, if it's too hot, you just close it. So we don't want to lose anything, right? We want to preserve it because we don't want to lose it. And we still can be pretty far away from water source. But if we can regulate it, or if it's raining, it's we open it, it's okay, we get in all of it, we need it right now, we can store it and do not get it out later on. So that adaptation also helped the diversification of all the plants, and then stabilizing the banks and basically shaping the surface of the earth as we know it today. But it was all happening 400 million years ago, again, pretty long time ago. And again, they really brought the oxygen up. Pretty much at the time when we pretty much reached more or less the concentrations we have today. And as a matter of fact, in Carboniferous, most of the, I'm not sure all, but most of the, what is the state fossil? Crinoids, they found in Carboniferous, right, in Mississippian? Well, at least around Columbia, that's for sure. And that was time when we actually had more oxygen in the atmosphere than today. And that was time when we had gigantic dragonflies and all those gigantic insects. And they were doing it not because they were happy. They were doing it because they were trying to overcome the oxygen poisoning. Because if you're small and you have too much oxygen, you burn. It's too much oxygen, it basically just destroys you. So they were getting bigger just to basically have a bigger blood circle inside of them and use all of that oxygen so that it would not burn them alive, basically. And we're almost there. I promise. And then another really great event which happened is the appearance of flowering plants. And it was 140. So the plants appeared somewhere at 400 million years, but we haven't had any flowering plants till 140, which is Mesozoic, which is already close to dinosaur time. And if you look out today, most of the plants you see, they're flowering plants. Almost not 100%, but close to it. You don't have that many conifers here. And the appearance of flowering plants brought the evolution of pollinators. And it's also, the flowering plants have a completely different composition in comparison with not flowering plants in terms of the chemicals. And we know extinction of dinosaurs at 65 million years as the meteorite, right? But there is another biological idea which scientists sometimes talk about, that these guys, when they appeared, they were eating not flowering plants, and they have a completely different chemical composition. And like, if you, when flowering plants appeared, they took over Earth pretty quickly. That's actually was Darwin was fascinated by that. When he died, he still was thinking, was like, how the hell they did that so fast everywhere. And basically, these guys, food changed without allowing them so much long time to actually adapt to that change. So some of the scientists, at least throwing out the ideas like, yes, we had meteorite. Yes, it was pretty bad. Yes, it was tsunamis and CO2 and the winter because of all the dust in the atmosphere. But also, they if you accidentally just very fast change food you eat, which you didn't used to, you at least will not feel good for a while. And if on top of that, there is meteorite, it's all of that, it's okay, I give up. I cannot do that anymore. It's greater. And yeah, sure. Actually, have you seen that? It's so cool. So usually we always were telling students that's okay, guys, yeah, it's very exciting, Jurassic Park, but DNA does not preserve an ember. And we just keep telling them and telling them and telling them. But the common culture shapes what scientists do too, partially. So apparently it was a group of scientists who were what if we can make it? And I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, it was a paper in Science or Nature, which people were able to preserve DNA inside of amber. Which is pretty cool, because we would never even had that scientific question unless the movie would screw it up, because we knew that doesn't happen. But apparently, if you have a very unique environment, you actually can do that. But it doesn't happen that often in fossil record. And if we go really close, if we look what's happening today, because after dinosaurs, everything else pretty much looks the same for the last 65 million years ago. I mean, there are whales, of course, but other than that. If we look in today, and we look, for example, this is coral reefs, what's happening to the coral reefs, right? They bleaching, and the bleaching of coral reefs, they consist of calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate, lime, it's really easily dissolved in the even very weak acid. And because we have so much CO2 in the atmosphere, and the more partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere, the more CO2 dissolves in the water. And when CO2 dissolves in the water, it makes a very weak but still acid. And so the more CO2 in the atmosphere, the more acidic water is. So our coral reefs start to dissolve, and that's all that white stuff or bleaching of corals happening. So we keep shaping the Earth in some case, and then the beautiful picture of glacial places which melt drastically, so fast. I was lucky enough to be in Patagonia at some point, and even during the time, I spent, I don't know, an hour maybe at the Perito Morena, one of those really famous glaciers where you can come really close. And even in an hour, it was several falls of complete falls of the walls of the glacier. And you when you see how fast it's happening, it's okay, we do really shape it. And basically, you probably know the temperature outside. Today's really nice, right? But the last couple of weeks was really bad. And I'm new to Missouri in general, but what my colleagues say who lived here for 15, 20 years, that it's getting worse and worse every year. So those numbers don't lie, really. And so what do we do from there? So we still, as top animals right now, we do shape Earth. And in this case, there is a light pollution, which disturbs a lot of animals. It disturbs us, really. It shifts all of our circadian clocks. We dissolving the reefs, melting of the glaciers. And basically the question, what we do with that, right? And because we actually, as a part of the ecosystem on this planet, we can shape it. I would not say that we can stop it, because again, as we saw today, right, that like the Earth, even before us, like way before us, Earth had glacial periods, and then it was really warm, and then it was again glacial periods. So it was happening. Something was happening inside, and the Earth was changing without us pumping up all the CO2 in the atmosphere. Like it was always something was pumping the CO2 in the atmosphere at some point, either volcanoes or something else. But if we can look at it just like a little bit more, when we do something, we like really think about what kind of outcome it can give to the planet, because we still do shape it as we were doing for probably the last 4 billion years ago.
Yeah, and the rate in which we are putting CO2 into the air is virtually unprecedented.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. And thank you for your attention. I'm so sorry that I was talking for so long. Yes?
I've got a bunch of questions.
Okay, cool.
Where on your timeline did DNA or some kind of chemical code start, do you think? In order for these organisms to reproduce or continue?
Well, I guess when you eukaryote and you have all those organelles inside of you, you're supposed to have at least some DNA. And that was happening around 1.6 billion years ago. So at that point, for sure, it was supposed to start happening. We do not know really on which rate, because the problem with DNA, like for example, mammoths, they do preserve DNA. I think like with dinosaurs, it's already like a little bit complicated. I mean, people do try to extract it, some more successful than others, but it's always partial. And so pretty much maybe like 65, maybe 100 millions, it's too much push for the DNA to be preserved. And so we do not really have any other evidence of its preservation.
From what I've heard, anything more than 2 million, you're not going to.
Yes, pretty much. So like all of the all the DNA which we find later on, like we can maybe find some parts and pieces, but we cannot constrain it all together to actually make to answer the question like how it actually looked like or what kind of genes it had. So
Did some of those early cells or whatever they were have to have some kind of code in order to
they probably did. I mean, yes, for reproduction they were supposed to have it. Bless you. But
prokaryotes have DNA.
Yes, they do. But like how that was happening, like I don't know.
Well, there is something called prebiotic life, where it's just the molecules.
Yes, there is a theory, and like I have a colleague of mine who studies a process which is called serpentinization, and it's basically what happens to basalts in middle ocean regions when all that molten material comes up and it gets to the surface of the ocean. It immediately interacts with water, and as soon as it interacts with water, it starts to change, right, chemically. And so the change of basalts, most of the time you will get serpentinization and formation of serpentine in it from olivine. It's from green to green, perfect reaction, because olivine is green and the serpentine is green. And what is interesting about it, that during that reaction, from olivine to serpentine, you actually producing at least some hydrogen, and the CO2 is pretty much was there by that time, And so if you compound hydrogen, CO2, and sulfur, which for example actually was there too when when the eruption happened, you pretty much have the most needed elements to create the organic compounds. And people do think that if we think about the emergence of life here, that probably those like eruptions of the underwater basalts probably a good spot for that. Was one problem: we were not really able to recreate it. Like we able to receive these small, like really small like organic compounds, but we were not able to recreate the whole process. But again, like it doesn't mean that it was not happening, because life is very often not predictable, and it's always a chance, right? Like what you have at that particular moment in that particular place, and how it bumps into each other, and which environment it was. Because especially when we're talking about the deep end, the further down in terms of age, all of our modeling, it's basically we assume it's like, okay, let's try this environment, like that amount of oxygen, that amount of CO2, like that amount of that, but we don't know. Like we do have some estimates based on like the mineralogy we see, or based on like some other evidence, but we don't know the exact numbers, and those exact like concentrations, they may be crucial if actually make it live, right? Like think about it. If you try to make a sourdough starter, like when you just mixing up the flour and water, like for the first week, you need to preserve it at a certain temperature. Because if you don't, your good bacteria will not grow, they will die, and you will need to start it all over again. But after that first week, with the certain temperature and the certain like nutrient which you put in, like the same flour and stuff, after a week, you can do whatever you want with it. You can put it in the fridge, you can leave it on the counter, it doesn't really matter. They will survive after they've grown up. And that maybe the same thing was happening with the early life, like, they would need like certain temperature, certain nutrient, and only when it all, bumps into each other, then it's done. But like, who knows if we actually trying the right recipe for it? We don't know yet, because we were not able to recreate it. But it's a great area of research for sure.
Natalia's
Yeah.
sourdough hypothesis.
Yeah, like I'm just trying to make one right now, so it's like it's very like on my mind. How to make sure that it's always the same temperature.
I started as sourdough.
Oh yeah, pretty much. Like that theory of basically like RNA broth. It's in a way the same thing, right?
How do you feel about Europa? And the Europa Clipper mission is being launched in September to go there and investigate. And it's like snowball Earth, because it's all in case.
Pretty much. I mean, the thing is that we just talk about that for original appearance of life or emergence of life, you must really need to have a very certain recipe in terms of the environment and chemistry. But what we know, for example, even on our planet, and like we don't know everything because we keep finding like new organisms, new environments, and like we actually don't know yet what life is possible, like what it can do.
We didn't even know about hydrothermal vents having life until 1977.
Yeah,
Or even
exactly.
newer ones too.
Yeah, exactly. And so today on the Earth, we have so many the organisms, most of the time those are archaeas, who can survive whatever, basically. And so in Europa, like if you have basically water, yes, it's frozen, but we actually don't know if it's frozen deep inside.
No, they know there's liquid. They know there's all three phases.
And so if you have that, and yes, it's probably coldish, but so, if life was already there, it's like, I'm pretty sure it can adapt. Like we can adapt to hot and cold, like, we're fine. Like we may be like, not happy about it. Like it's not ideal, but we can live there, like here. And I'm pretty sure like that life in the way of microbial life it's much possible there. As well as on Mars, it's there. We're just like, I guess when we're looking for life, we always expect to find, either humanoids there. It's like, we want everything. But sometimes life is microscopic and it's like unicellular and you cannot see it. It's still life. It has pretty much the same process. It does the same processes in a way than we do. It just doesn't look like we expect it, and that's why we keep looking for it. Yes.
On one of your slides, you showed the curving track of, I guess, something crawling along. How did you determine that meant they had a right and a left side? And is that necessary for higher organisms to evolve?
We were talking about Bilaterians because we are Bilaterians and it's like a big group of the Tree of Life. The reason why I was talking about that, that's not what I wanted to do. Can I do? No, I can't do that. The reason why I was talking about it because the Ediacarans, they were not bilateral, like at all, most of the time. And so they were not as closely related. Here, the reason why we think that they were bilaterians because the shape of the boreal has like meniscus shape, and like in order to make that moon-shaped track, like you need to have something central and like the parts on the side, right? So that's the only way you can move. And if the sides are not symmetrical, you would not be able to do that, like physically. And so because of that, we do think that they were bilaterians. And as soon as we get to bilaterians, we basically can talk about like true animals in a way, because most of us, with exception of like sponges, corals, and like those like lower ones in a way in the Tree of Life, like everything above that pretty much has bilaterian symmetry. So that's why it's important. So as soon as we see that in paleontological records, like okay, here for sure animals, like true animals, should be there. Because sponges, they are animals, but they're weird. I do not know if you ever tried it, but like if you take a sponge from water, from like ocean water, you break it down, like really break it down, and then put it back to the water, it grows back. We don't do that. Like if you break us down, like that's it. That's the last day. Thank you very much. But sponge is the only organisms like in the animals who do that. So with sponges, we always have a lot of problems because in reality, it's basically a colony of cells, which for some reason decided that it's really nice to be together. It's like, okay, I kind of like you, let's live together, let's filter that water. I will filter the water, you will protect me, and I'll share the food. That's pretty much it. So they do not have the same kind of construction as we do, or like any other animals. And so when we get to bilaterians, it means that we're getting close to like what we normally would consider true animals. That's why that part was important for the evolution of life. Any other questions? No? Thank you very much.
And thank you. We appreciate it. A lot of it is up here for me.
I'm so sorry.
No, it was great.
It was
Great
very
to hear.
interesting.
Yes. Wanted to tell everybody this presentation was brought and sponsored by Lori Evelyn, State Farm Insurance here at St. Genevieve. So thank you. So in future events that we have here, September 18th, we're going to talk about the Loop. A couple from St. Genevieve that bought a yacht in Alton, sailed down through the Underwaterway, went out around the eastern coast and come back in through the Great Lakes. They're going to tell their story. October the 2nd, we're gonna have Stonehands here, and Stonehands does what, Fred? He's,
So he tries to reproduce, no, doesn't try, he does it. He reproduces arrowheads and axe heads and things like that, where he, you know.
Is this Arrowhead Fred you're talking about?
No,
That's
someone different.
Oh, okay.
Then October 29th, we're gonna have David Fiedler here, and he wrote the book, The Enemy Among Us, which was about the Weingarten prisoner of war camp, the Italian soldiers that were housed here in Missouri. And on 11/13, we're actually gonna have a person here from Red Tails. Fred, you wanna elaborate on that a little bit?
So during World War II, there was a group of black Americans that back in those days, they really didn't think they could do a lot of things. But they put this group together and they trained them to be pilots, and they ended up being some of the best pilots there ever was here. And so it's a daughter of one of the Red Tail original Tuskegee Airmen. I met up with her, and she is president of the chapter up there in Kansas City, and she's going to be doing a talk for us to tell stories. There aren't any more Tuskegee Airmen left. They've all passed. So that ought to be really interesting.
Yeah, they made a movie about that, right?
Yeah,
So-
yeah, the Red Tails.
And they call them Red Tails because they painted the back of their airplanes red,
Right.
the tail end of it, so very good
Now, what was
show.
the date of that? The date?
That's November 13th, great.
The interesting about that, Steph's dad flew bombers out of Italy, and the Red Tails were with them. And,
Is that right?
and
What
he-
bomber group was that? Do you
I don't
know?
remember what it was, but the history of the Red Tails is they never lost a bomber.
I heard that's a misnomer.
But
I heard that's not necessarily true, that's a misnomer.
that's what he said.
I'm just saying, I know that's commonly said, but I've heard there's a lot of, that wasn't necessarily true. That's a misnomer.
But they did change the way that they took those bombers, but because before, they would go out, they would bring in a group of fighter planes.
Right, no, I
There'd be
understand,
two of them.
I understand, but I'm telling you that, from my understanding, that's actually a misnomer from, they actually did have losses.
Oh, I don't dispute that. You would almost think that would be.
It did, it's a read, I'm not trying to put down their accomplishment, but I always heard that was supposedly a
Well,
misnomer.
it would be very interesting to have one of your
Yeah.
family members
No, that's
here
cool.
that actually is going to talk about it. So,
It will be.
and yes, there is a movie out called The Red Tails, which I watched last night.
Oh, you did?
Yes, I
Good.
did. I finally found a DVD player to play it.
Finally did your homework.
So, those are all future. Again, we want to thank Lori Ebling for sponsoring this, and thank you so much for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thank you
Very
for
good.
hosting me.
It was
Thank you.
really
Another
good.
round for
Yeah.
Natalia.